So to start things, my first question, first of all, thank you so much for joining me today, Gustav Gressel. The first question I wanted to ask you was, what is your assessment of the situation on the ground and the military buildup? How likely do you think a military invasion by Russia of the Ukraine is at this point in time?
Well, the military invasion is seriously prepared. We don't know if Putin will give the order to do so, but the preparation are quite severe. So we have seen the assembly of Russian military forces. Over the past week, sort of the influx of forces as such, except for sort of the Belarusian part, has slowed down. Sort of the pace where the 1st Tank Guards Army, the 6th Army, is situated, reinforcement into Crimea, into the 22nd Army Corps, the reinforcement into the Donbass. They have shifted more from the forces side to ammunition supplies, fuel, etc. Then we have also more sort of adding more combat support troops, artillery, especially rocket artillery, air defense, electronic warfare, combat engineers, especially those who are, so these combat troops who are supposed to fight around Ukraine, around Kiev, sorry, sort of to take the capital, because you have to cross the Dnieper, or if you come from the other side, there are extensive swamps and sort of difficult to cross terrain. So you need support from combat engineers to build bridges and to make amphibious river crossings, all that kind of stuff. Electronic warfare troops. Now, actually, in a previous interview, I said I'm still missing the National Guard, and we have today there are pictures coming of some National Guards troops being loaded, and I think we will see more over the coming days. This is sort of troops to set up an occupation government and to sort of crush civil resistance behind the lines. The Air Force, I guess, over the coming days will also start to make readiness exercises and start to conduct air exercises in order to increase the strength in and around Ukraine. There are plenty of air bases actually there that can be used and can be piled up. The logistical preparations of the aerospace forces are a bit difficult to observe just from satellite pictures and sort of social media posts. I can hardly judge that with the information I have at the current point, but it sort of it from what we can observe as civilians without electronic intelligence and without other satellite pictures, Air Force is something that probably will hit us by surprise. So they can move in planes very quickly, and if they have the logistical preparations to have the fuel and the ammunition in place at the bases, which is we can't check up, is something you can increase the intensity of air operations from these bases within a relatively short amount of time. So you don't have much pre-warning time on that. So that says sort of that the picture is bleak, but on the other hand, we don't know what Putin really will decide to do. He can give the order to invade. He cannot. I think he will rather sort of try first and then sort of push to instigate an incident and then sort of see how that goes, whether the West is really as united as it pretends to be, whether the Ukrainian government is as sort of unstable as the Russians expect it to be, because I think here the Russians have several sort of misestimations in all their war plans, sort of bullying or compelling the Ukraine government to comply with their demands on basically to put their sovereignty at the negotiating table. That's something sort of the Russians underestimate the Ukrainian reluctance to do that, and I would guess that it would start as a minor endeavor and then escalate into the bigger ones once Russia realizes that its war aims are not within reach with only a limited military operation, and I would have to apply for pressure. That would be my guess in this scenario.
Okay, so essentially, it's from what you're saying, it sounds as if some kind of military intervention is possible soon. I wanted to take you back to a piece you published on the European Council on Foreign Relations website last month, where talking about the Ukraine crisis, you're saying, unless the West makes a greater effort to counter Russian military coercion, there is no guarantee that the Russians will stop with Ukraine. So I wanted to ask you two questions off the back of that. do you think the recent delivery of military hardware by some NATO members to Ukraine would be enough to counter Russian military coercion? And secondly, also referring back to your point where you said that the Russians will not stop with Ukraine, are you saying that in the event of a full-scale military invasion by Russia, they could potentially go as far as attacking NATO members directly on NATO territory?
Sort of, I mean, both stories are sort of complicated, but they're interrelated. So, to answer the second question first, what does concern NATO? I think, as I said again, I think as I followed the Russian discussion on this, they're insufficiently factoring in Ukrainian society as such and their will to resist any Russian occupation regime. Here on the side of many in Moscow, the sort of their own preconcepts about Ukraine being split in the middle, and there's sort of considerable sort of everybody that speaks Russian has a Russian identity, which is not true. There are a lot of Ukrainian patriots that only speak Russian. Ukraine is a nation that defines itself more by politics and by societal trends than through language, which is something Russia doesn't get. And sort of the cost this implies for Russia if they were pushed into that. Also sort of the chances of Ukrainian civilian resistance movements, etc. And that if they would attribute that to the West, sort of Ukraine resisting, as they do now. They attribute Zelensky being the Western puppet. But they will face resistance. Now, if they do, they attribute it to the West, they can't put it down, they would sort of use the military, nuclear threat, military threats, conventional military threats against the West to kind of compel the West into stopping to support Ukraine. The problem is, it's not in our hands to determine what the Ukrainian society fights for or not. They will fight because of their own fate. And this is nothing really sort of the West can guarantee Moscow that we will stop doing or supporting, because we are not in a central command situation in that. So, but in Russian perception, we will be. So the Russians will sort of use the military and use their competitive advantage, which is in military force, to bully us into that, and that will lead to confrontations that might come sour over NATO member states. That might well involve neutral states in Europe that sort of make a decision to track back on the neutral status in the light of an invasion of Ukraine. And there are all kinds of nasty scenarios. The long-term current on this is also that from Moscow's perspective, Europe is weak and Europe is not something that needs to be accounted for. They only count the Americans as serious players in Europe, and the rest sort of is decadent and slow. And the more we give the impression of Russia that they're right in their estimation, that we are sort of a reluctant mass of decadent societies that only care for themselves, the more they will be inclined to use the military card and push us, because that's, from their point of view, what brings the shortest cut to a success. And this is where sort of the concentrated effort comes from, and that regards both supporting Ukraine in maintaining its independence and sovereignty, as well as our own signaling that we would care for security and we are prepared to meet Russian bullying and threats with our own means. And these are basically, we saw in the last days that fighter jets, that troops are put on alert, that we reinforce the military posture in the East. Again, the US take the lead, that's good, but I'm actually very positively surprised that a lot of European countries join these efforts, both by deploying planes and military crafts and warships towards Eastern Europe to signal solidarity and preparedness, as well as helping Ukrainians with armaments and lethal weapons. I mean, I know that there's this quite pointless discussion about escalation dominance. No weapon system delivered as now will ultimately and fundamentally change the military balance. But from a Russian perspective, If I see that that there is a majority of European countries that have a domestic mandate to deliver lethal aid to the Ukrainians, I can guess that these countries will have a domestic mandate to impose harsh and brutal economic sanctions on Russia as well, and will be willing to do that. And will be able to fight that decision out in national parliaments. And that is sort of what the bigger meaning of these deliveries, that it signals the Russians we are not as decadent and weak and divided as you might assume we are.
And then one final question to finish on, and going back to something you just mentioned now, as in the wider ramifications of a potential military invasion of those EU members which are not members of NATO. There's obviously been a big debate or some kind of a debate happening in Sweden and Finland about whether or not they might potentially join NATO in the future. Okay, it's just a debate. I wanted to ask you briefly about Austria. Correct me if I'm wrong, in whose armed forces you've served. Austria, of course, is not a NATO member. In the event of a military invasion to Ukraine, do you think that debate would become more lively, firstly in Sweden and Finland, and secondly in your native Austria? Do you think Austria could potentially think about joining NATO, or is that something which is really out of the question?
On Austria, I would say it's not on the table yet, because Austria would not have a border to Russia or to occupied Ukraine. There's still Hungary in between. What I think might happen is that we had a kind of pro-Russian constituency in Austria, so all major parties were in favor of deep economic relations to Russia. We're basically closing both eyes if these economic relations were abused by intelligence forces and other subversive state actors to conduct, organize, or orchestrate subversive actions either in Austria or against another EU member state by the use with the use of Austrian facilities and territory. There's still an exemption to EU financial sanctions on Russian state-owned banks that applies to European subsidiaries of state-owned banks, and they all reside in Vienna. And that was sort of an Austrian condition to agree on EU sanctions back in 2014 on Russia, that they would be exempted, and Austria profited a lot from that by sort of Russian FDI that is dispersed across Europe, but all channeled and funneled through Vienna. And the shock of a major war in Europe and a Russian occupation and the associated human costs of it, I think would rather make Austria rethink its cozy relations with Russia, and politicians would get public questions from newspapers, from civil society organizations, whether these are the men you really want to make business with, and that would cost Russia something. I think that would be more likely compared to Austria joining NATO.